Let me welcome all of you to this conference today on China as a global power, contending views from inside China. My name is Henry Now. I'm a professor at George Washington University at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I'm also very pleased to be co-director with my colleague, Professor Olapale, from whom you will hear later this afternoon, in a research project on worldviews of aspiring powers, domestic foreign policy debates. Now, this conference is an outgrowth of that project. We couldn't have, I think, selected a better time for a conference. What do you think? We have a new government, or I suppose you could say a renewed government in the United States just 2 weeks ago, and as of last week, or this past week, we have, in fact, a new government in China. I understand the hottest post in town right now is the lineup of the new government in China. So if you have that, slip it to us and we'll print it and get it around, who are the members of the Standing Committee, the Politburo, and the other major institutions of the Chinese government. We're especially pleased to sponsor the conference in partnership with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and its Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. The Wilson Center is a recognized home for scholarship in this city. I had the pleasure of being a fellow at this institution some years ago now, when the institute was in fact on the Mall in the Smithsonian Castle. I must say, I liked that setting a little better. I got lost in this building this morning. It was a little homier and pleasant, but I enjoyed that year and got a lot of work done. In fact, wrote one of my books. So I've always had a special place in my heart for the Institute, and we're just very pleased to be doing this conference together with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're grateful to Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who is going to be part of our program during the day. We'll introduce our speaker at lunch. He helped us to set this conference up here in cooperation with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We also thank his associates, Doug Spellman and Sandy Foe. Finally, we want to thank, of course, the current president and CEO of the Wilson Center, the former Congresswoman and Honorable Jane Harman. She will be addressing our lunch at the conference today. Now, I also want to thank my GW colleagues, particularly, of course, my colleague and co-director of this project, Deepa Olapale. It's been actually a lot of fun working with Deepa on this project over the past 3 years. And our two colleagues from GW who will be on the program today, David Shambaugh and Robert Sutter, Bob Sutter. They'll chair our panels this morning. And the introductions, by the way, for all these people are in your program, so I'm not going to take time to do that. And I also want to thank the staff at the Elliott School. It's been truly one of the best staffs I've ever worked with in my rather long years in the academic profession, and we really appreciate it. Our executive director, Matt Rieger, research associates Amy Shi and Winnie Nam, and our assistants, Mike Buford and Sheng Pen. Now, one more important administrative matter before I turn to substance. I'm told that all of us must wear these tags all day, even though they keep falling off, as I've already experienced, because the name tags show which sessions, including the lunch, that you've RSVP'd for. Now, we are at capacity, and so we will be checking to see if, in fact, you did RSVP for the events. So please keep your badges on. Now to the substance of our conference today. Our Worldviews project is one of 5 research projects at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School, known as the Rising Powers Initiative. The project focuses on key countries in Asia and Eurasia, involving more than 30 scholars around the United States and the region. 3 of these projects are supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, under the corporation's focus on, and I quote, exploring U.S. relations with pivotal powers in a changing global environment, end quote. The other 2 projects beside our World's View project are the Project on Middle East Political Science, run by Professor Mark Lynch at our Institute for Middle East Studies, The second one, the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, known as PONARS Eurasia, co-directed by Professors Henry Hale and Corey Welt at our institute, at the Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Now, earlier this year, Carnegie awarded a grant of some $2 million to the Elliott School to support these programs. And we're obviously extremely appreciative of that support. And I think, Pat, are you here? Pat Nicholas will be here sometime during the course of the day. She's probably on an early shuttle flight at the moment coming down from New York, but she's our program officer at the Carnegie Corporation, and we are indebted to her for her guidance and counsel throughout this effort. Now, the World Youth Project was initiated 3 years ago. It examines rising powers, or what we call aspiring powers, in Asia and Eurasia, and assesses the implications of the domestic debates in these countries about their foreign policy for U.S. foreign policy. Now, the 5 aspiring powers are China, India, Iran, Japan, and Russia. Premise of the project, obviously, was very simple. These countries are becoming more and more important in the world community, and it's essential for us to know more and more about the complexity and the nature of their internal discussions about their role in the world as they become more important. The first phase of the project involved comparative analysis, individual country studies, and a series of conferences in Delhi, Beijing, and Moscow that brought together U.S. and foreign country specialists to explore these domestic debates and their implications for the United States. Now, the first phase of the project produced a volume. That volume is available to you, in fact, this morning in the lobby. It is entitled Worldviews of Aspiring Powers, Domestic Foreign Policy Debates in China, India, Iran, Japan, and Russia. It is on sale, by the way, in the lobby. I wish we could give them all away. But they are on sale for 60% less just for this conference. So it's a good buy, and we hope that you'll pick it up or at least look at it and see what we have been about. Now, the second phase of the project involves conferences in the Washington community designed to bring our analysis and the foreign policy discussions in these rising and aspiring powers, since some of them have already risen, you could argue, in the case of Japan, to bring those debates to the attention of the Washington policy community. Now, we held our first conference in January on the domestic discussions in India, working with the Center for a New American Security here in Washington. After our conference today, which we're doing, of course, on China with the Woodrow Wilson Center, we'll hold further conferences in March on Russia's domestic discussions, working with our Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And then in June on Japanese internal discussions about foreign policy, cooperating with the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the Worldviews Project brings something novel, we think, to sort of policy analysis in Washington and in the academic community as a whole. It looks at how ideas influence the interpretation of events and over time actually help shape those events. Normally, we study policy by looking at reactions to events and circumstances. We study sort of what are the immediate factors that we're involved with in terms of dealing with some particular problem. And these studies are very useful. But if we only did that, we would never understand how circumstances change and how ideas, strategies, schools of thought, debates, how they play a role in changing circumstances. We would not understand, in short, how human beings help shape and not just respond to world events. Debates that take place today in China and the United States will help shape events that happen tomorrow. In the United States, for example, we debate often our foreign policy in terms of various schools of thought or various ideas. These schools have roots in our thinking and the history of the country. We refer to them sometimes as grand strategies, foreign policy traditions, worldviews, or schools of thought. They include nationalist, realist, liberal internationalist, and conservative internationalist approaches to world affairs. We even have institutes and journals that promote these various approaches to foreign policy. They facilitate the debate in the United States, and, very importantly, they help foreign observers access our debates and therefore understand more about what is going on in our country. Now, we had the idea that we should apply that notion to foreign countries. That is, we should ask what kinds of debates are going on in their country, and are those debates associated with certain institutes and journals that we could follow that we could track in an ongoing way. So we did this in the 5 countries we studied. We identified recurrent schools of thought, and we tracked the center of gravity of the debate among these schools over time in these countries. Now, which school or combination of schools were stronger or weaker at some point of time? Which is on the rise and which is on the decline? The specific schools in each country, of course, differ, right? But the generic categories that we developed do not. In all cases, we identified 3 broad groups of worldviews: nativist or nationalist schools, realist or great power schools, and internationalist or globalist schools. These are not rigid categories, and individuals may move around among them. But the schools do persist over time, also in other countries, in foreign countries, and they do make it easier for us to understand and to track the debates that are going on in those countries. Now, we then also asked, what do these shifts in the domestic debates in these aspiring powers, what do they mean for for relations with the United States? Now, as you can imagine, that will depend to some extent on the different schools of thought in the United States, how they perceive what is going on in China, inside China, and in relationships with between China and the United States. What do they see? What do they think to be important? So as a final feature of our study, we asked what happens when schools of thought diverge or converge across countries. In other words, when a movement takes place in the United States, more in a nationalist or realist direction, or maybe in a liberal internationalist direction, and movement in the debate in a foreign country, an aspiring country, moves in the opposite direction, or maybe in the same direction. What are the implications of these shifts in debates, domestic debates, the center of gravity of domestic debates across countries? And how can we use those shifts to anticipate what may happen in the future? In some sense, how then do debates influence the way in which events actually unfold? Now, one of the interesting conclusions of the study that was drawn out by Professor Olopoli in her conclusions is that it's very apparent nationalist and realist schools of thought in all of the aspiring countries that we studied, including, of course, the United States, not necessarily an aspiring country, but the focus of the implications of these debates, we found that all of these schools were strengthening. Nationalist and realist schools are, in fact, on the rise in most of these countries, while globalist and economic schools, or economic integrationist schools, are weakening. Now, that could be potentially very important, all right, for where we're heading in the future. A nationalist or a realist-shaped world might be a more contentious and dangerous world. Maybe not. Sometimes people think we ought to leave each other alone a little more, give each other more space to do whatever it is that we want to do. But it's conceivable that it could be. By anticipating, by spotlighting, tracking, and anticipating these shifts in domestic debates, we may very well be able to anticipate changes in real-world events themselves. At least it's worth contemplating. So that's enough of the substance to get us started. There's obviously much more in the book, and hopefully will come out in our discussion today. But this introduction also, I think, helps you to understand the structure of our conference today, because we're going to begin this morning with panels involving our Chinese guests, who will help us to try to understand some of the different points of view, all right, that are expressed in China and that are involved in the Chinese debate about its role in the world. All right, we will follow that then after our lunch with a discussion among Americans, whom we have selected with some idea as to the possibility that they might differ in terms of how they think about American foreign policy and about U.S. relations with China. And they will reflect, they are all here this morning, by the way, we asked them to be here, they will reflect on what they have heard this morning. And then as our final panel of the day, we will give our Chinese guests the last word. We'll invite them back to the podium to, in fact, reflect on what they just heard from the Americans. So this is a conversation among our panelists. We didn't ask them to prepare papers. We sent them a set of questions that we wanted them to think about. And we hope that we have a somewhat more spontaneous, somewhat more extemporaneous discussion in the course of the day. Now, I have to really pay special thanks to our Chinese guests for doing this. They understood the format of this conference from the day we began the planning, and they were ready to come and not only to speak to us in our language. That's an enormous compliment and gift to us. We realize that. We Americans go around the world assuming everybody speaks English, but we know it's your second language, and that sometimes it's, you can't always be as good in your second language as you are in your first. So we really appreciate your willing to do this. We also didn't ask them to prepare papers. We asked them to be a little bit more informal in their reaction to the questions. So we really owe them an enormous debt of thanks, and we do appreciate it. You have added immensely to our education about your country in this manner. So let me now turn over the discussion to our first panel and to my colleague David Shambaugh, who is just back from Beijing and or Shanghai, I guess you were, and is going to sort of chair the first panel dealing with security issues. Then Mr. Sutter, Robert Sutter, another colleague of ours at GW, by the way, we're very pleased to have Bob, who has joined us in the last couple of years, a long time sort of China analyst here in Washington. He will chair the second panel. So, David, let me invite you and the Chinese panelists to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. 同志们好. 朋友们早. Well, first, I have to begin with an apology for my voice. I've just, as Henry just noted, came back a couple nights ago from Shanghai and came back with one of those airplane head congestion things. So it's working its way through me. My voice is not what it normally is. Hopefully I won't lose it during the course of the next hour. But with that, I just wanted to really echo some of the comments that Henry has just made in terms of welcoming all of you and the importance of this project. It's a very important project. It's now, as he just described, moved into its sort of second phase. Produced this wonderful book, which I commend to you. Makes a great holiday gift if you're beginning to think forward to do a little early Christmas shopping. And we have copies outside, as he mentioned. And today's conference is not only part of this broader project, it's also a follow-on to one that we convened in Beijing in May of 2010 with the kind assistance and cooperation of the China Foreign Affairs University and Professor Julie Chun and her colleagues there, which was very, very successful. So I wish to note that. And want to welcome, I just want to second Henry's warm words of welcome for our three Chinese colleagues and friends who've traveled a very long way. Last night, I came back 2 nights ago, so I know how I felt yesterday. They just arrived last night from China, so they're in better shape, I think, than I was. It's a long trip, no matter how many times you do it. So really delighted. These are three of China's really leading thinkers and voices on international relations and national security in China. They're also three personal friends of long standing, I must say. 25, 30 years we've all known each other. I remember, in fact, the Wilson Center, the very first time I met now Major General Ju. He was Senior Colonel, I think, Ju. Colonel Ju, yeah, he hadn't even reached Senior Colonel yet. Was at the Wilson Center when the Wilson Center was in the Smithsonian Castle I was directing the Asia program that year, and you were, if I recall correctly, the first exchange student at the U.S. National Defense University from the PLA National Defense University. You're in the first group, at least.
Yes.
So that was 1986?
1988.
88.
Yeah.
Your memory is better than mine. This is why you've done better in your career than I have. Anyway, delightful to have you back at the Smithsonian and the Wilson Center, now Major General Ju. And Shunding Li, who is Dean of the School of International Affairs at Fudan University, which I might say is the partner institution for the Elliott School of International Affairs in China. Also a very, very dear and longtime friend. We share the same surname, we share the same wristwatch, we share many of the same ideas in common. And Julie Chun, who's a dear friend and was a Fulbright scholar at the Sigur Center just a few years ago. So these are three, I'm really delighted to have all three of you here. Thank you for taking the time and traveling so far. So as Professor Now has just, oh, and I should mention, for those of you who came expecting from the program, Zhang Yun Ling to be on this panel as well. Apologies for his absence, but one of the hats that Professor Zhang wears is as a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, the CPPCC, Foreign Affairs Committee. And as you all know, the Chinese Communist Party's National Congress has been convening over the last week, but simultaneously the CPPCC also has some activities, and he had to stay in Beijing for those and hence could not be here for our session, with his regrets and ours too. But we have three excellent Chinese scholars, so let us not waste more time on preliminaries. We have a number of kind of topics that I want to have a conversation too, not just pose questions and answers, but we'll be lucky if we can get through half of the topics that I'd like to. But given, I'm sure there are many people in the audience who stayed, like me, stayed up until 11 o'clock last night to see the new Chinese leadership walk across the red carpet in the Great Hall of the People, the new 7-member standing committee of the Politburo. So I just want to, this is a kind of current events question. The rest of our discussion is not going to be so current events oriented and hopefully deeper, but I'm just wondering if our three Chinese colleagues have any reactions to the new leadership, both the party leadership and indeed the Central Military Commission leadership, because we've had a number of promotions of generals to new positions. The CMC has almost completely turned over. Well, I think it has completely turned over, maybe one or two.
Still some.
So I just wonder, we don't want to take too much time on this subject, but if you have any quick, immediate, this is Washington. Washington loves this kind of stuff, who's up, who's down, what does it mean? But this is important. This was a very significant event. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on the new Chinese elite on the party side. We'll find out in March at the National People's Congress who will take positions on the government side and on the military side. So why don't we just quickly start with that? Ding Li, do you have any quick observations you'd like to ask? And you might want to press your microphone.
Well, I'm impressed by.
It's on. Okay.
By the fact that Mr. Hu Jintao both steps down from his two titles, party secretary and the chairman of the party's military central commission. I'm impressed. That, in my personal view, sets a good precedent for our institutional building to centralize the notion that the party control the armed force, not the other way around, or to have 2, 3 multiple centers of leadership at one time. So this is a great institutional progress, in my view.
Also, I think this is a successful transition. It's already over. I think the team is very capable, very experienced, and they have been promoted from the very bottom to the highest level. And also, I think that there will be a lot of continuity. Of course, there will be change. But what they are going to do is very much unpredictable. If you read the report made by the President Hu Jintao at the very beginning, the first day of the 18th National Congress.
Okay, General Zhu.
I'm impressed by this transition, as Professor Ding Li mentioned just now. The stepping down from the position of chairman of the Central Military Commission by Mr. Hu Jintao is set a very good example, and I think it's a development of politics in China. Secondly, as Professor Zhu mentioned, it is too early for us to predict what the new generation of leaders will do. But two things I think they have to do. One is to carry out the political reform. The second is to counter corruption.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for your thoughts. Really appreciate that. We're going in the weeks and months ahead. All of us, I think, collectively going to try and follow this very carefully, see what continuity and what changes do come in both the domestic and the international spheres. All right. Well, let's turn to the subject of the conference. This first panel, as you know, is devoted to security and defense policy. Foreign policy is sort of in the background. The next panel focuses more on economics, international institutions, global governance sorts of issues. So, excuse me, I'm going to pose a series of questions for our colleagues for discussion on the security defense front. But let me start with picking up on one point that Professor Now made in his opening comments about the purpose of this project, which is to try and understand not just what contending worldviews or debates are in different countries, but the linkage between those debates and policy. After all, debates are interesting in and of themselves. I myself have looked at perceptions and worldviews in China since my graduate school days. But in addition to being interesting amongst themselves, the implications for policy are what, at the end of the day, we should also be concerned with. So I'm just curious for our three Chinese colleagues, if you have any observations about how foreign policy debates and national security debates in China take place, and how, to what extent do they influence policy deliberations and actual policies? Because we outside of China spend a lot of our time studying what you write, what you say, and ask ourselves constantly, and we are asked of us, so what does this mean for Chinese policy? What's the linkage between debate and policy? So I'm just kind of curious if, I mean, mind you, we debate in the United States about policy all the time, and people ask us if we have any influence on American policy. I think the answer is no. But I'm just curious, in China, the extent, if you could reflect a little bit on this linkage. So Ding Li, do you want to start again?
Before we more formally open, we start now.
Yeah, if you want to.
And how many minutes you would give to each of us?
Well, we have an hour. We have 45 minutes, and I'm going to be posing a series of questions to you. This is the first question.
It's all for you.
So it's a question by question.
Question by question, right.
Well, there are some debate in the country regarding whether China should ally with a foreign country. Probably my girlfriend Yan Xuetong, Ding Yan, has this idea we should ally with someone, probably Russia. I disagree. I think we are very powerful. Only you are weak, you need to ally with someone. We are so powerful, we don't need to ally with anyone. And we don't have unsurmountable difficulty. We have a big difficulty like question of Taiwan, and we have managed this difficulty over decades with America. And we should be able to continue to manage it toward eventual peaceful settlement. So why we would feel more threat that would warrant us to take a very unconventional approach. I think we are safe, and we should view that the back in Asia pivoting may not be a real threat to China, but maybe a early wake-up call for us to reflect our handling of many international issues, how we should shape our friend to continue to work with us peacefully, how we should conduct our business in a way that is not only be self-portrayed as legitimate, but also be accepted by others as legitimate. And what will be the measures to measure against? How to judge it is legitimate or not? So I think not a time for airlines, and never would have such a time that we need to think about this. We are secure and others are secure. We should make others more secure, and we should be able to make others to bring more security to us.
Well, Li Chun, you've written a very interesting study that was published by the European Institute of Security Studies in Paris a couple of years ago on Chinese foreign policy debates. Do you have any reflections about this question?
I think last year I asked one of my PhD students to write a paper on this issue, especially what kind of link between scholars' debates and the policymakers. But finally, I think I'm not satisfied with the funding. Still, that we don't know exactly what kind of influence that a scholar can place to the government decision making. But here I want to say that nowadays in China, we have it's difficult for us to find the consensus over everything. This is true. Everything is divided among scholars. Especially when we are talking about the foreign policy issues concerning different kind of levels for policy issues, that we can find different ideas and different opinions. This is very much true. So year 2010, I wrote a paper demanded by the EU SS Director Alvaro Vasconcelos. He asked me to write a paper on these debates. So I wrote the Shire paper. I divided different opinions into three kinds of categories. One is a little bit realist point of view oriented. The second group of people's opinion are very, very much liberal ideas. And third one is constructive ideas. So mainly that we can divide it, we can look at the different ideas, we can put the different ideas into these three categories. This is very much true. For example, when we're talking about keeping low profile, this is one of the principles of China's foreign policy. You see different ideas over this issue. Some people argue that we should abandon this principle, but some people argue that we should keep it because it is not a technique, or it's not a strategy. It's kind of philosophical thinking guiding Chinese foreign policy, that we should not seeking hegemonic position in the world. We should modest. So, but for others, they gave a different interpretation of this keeping low profile. So everything is debated nowadays in China. This is very much true. Secondly, I want to say that foreign policy decision making is becoming very open nowadays, open to the public, that the public opinions can make some kind of influence over policy making. For example, nowadays the officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they would like to attend different kinds of seminars and workshops to listen to the scholars, and also they assign scholars to do some kind of research over different kinds of policy issues, and they read this research articles, research reports. Especially, they are very much interested in listening to the scholars about their recommendations on everything. So nowadays, that the policy making process is quite open to the public and also to scholars.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And General Zhu, what about the PLA in these policy debates? In Washington, we frequently hear the opinion that the PLA is always the most hawkish element in these foreign policy debates in China. But give us your sense of the PLA's role.
First, don't try to listen to those guys speak on CCTV 4, Channel 4. They are a little bit hawkish, but I don't think they are the mainstream of the PLA. Second, I believe that China's foreign policy in the recent years have been issue-oriented. I don't think we have a preset policy for the different issues which are happening in China's foreign relations with other countries. And third is that China's foreign policy has been reactive. And fourthly, I think the decision-making process of foreign policy is becoming increasingly democratic. As Professor Zhu mentioned, that more and more scholars have been involved in providing policy recommendations to the practitioners in different agencies concerning China's foreign policy. Actually, PLA has very little say on the formulation of China's foreign policy. Don't try to listen to those guys speaking on Channel 4. That's not true. And of course, I have to argue that many people are criticizing the policies of China's foreign policy and criticizing the foreign ministry. And they criticize them because they believe that they are too soft and they are too tolerant. Actually, it's very difficult for them to imagine how difficult the foreign policy makers are. I mean, what kind of difficulties they have. I believe that foreign policy making is mainly the business of top leaders instead of foreign ministry. I think on all of many issues, they can only provide suggestions and policy recommendations. The final decision will be made by the top leaders instead of by foreign minister or some of the agencies under the foreign ministry. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, all three. That contextualizes our discussion, I think, for the whole day. So I just wanted to try and get your sense of this broader issue. Well, let's also start with a kind of definitional question. I mean, all countries define their national security in different ways. There are different elements in their national security. In the United States, at least pre-9/11, I would submit that when we talk about national security, it was almost exclusively in military terms and in external terms. Domestic terrorism, or terrorism brought to our shores from abroad, was not necessarily part of our thinking. Since 9/11, of course, homeland security has become a much more significant part of our own American definition of national security. But I wonder if the three of you could offer us your sense of how Chinese define 国家安全, national security, the different components of it, economic security, political security, non-traditional security, cultural. Recently at the party plenum last year, former General Secretary Hu Jintao used the word 文化安全, I believe, in his address. So cultural security is now, at least in the vocabulary in China. And of course, territorial security and military security. So I would at least throw out those 5 different elements. But I wonder if the 3 of you could reflect on these different types. Why don't we start, change this around a little bit and start with General Ju, if you could maybe speak to the territorial and the military and the non-traditional security side, what the PLA calls military operations other than war.
First of all, there are controversial views on China's security. In my understanding, national security means this country is not threatened by any other outsiders with imminent war or internal protection and the daily life of people can be maintained in order. This we call security. According to this sort of definition, security, national security includes external security and internal security. At present, I believe China is facing a very, very complicated security environment. Internally, I think we are facing a lot of problems, like the problem of the corruption, like the problem of confidence, like the problem of short of trust over the leadership and over the government and the Communist Party, like the problem of ethnic groups, like the problem of religions, like the problem of uneven development, the problem of uneven distribution of the social wealth, etc. So all these are the internal issues. And of course, if you look at outside, China's security environment is also very, very complicated. China is facing all the challenges and the threats that are faced by other major powers. China is also facing a lot of challenges and the threats that are not faced by other major powers. The problems I mentioned above, some of them belong to traditional security, while some belong to non-traditional security issues, like the ethnic issue, like the internal problems. And with outside, I think as far as the outside or external security concerned, I think China mainly faces these sort of challenges. One is the fact that the disputes over territory and over maritime interest. As you can see in the recent years, we have disputes over South China Sea, we have disputes over East China Sea. And some of the issues have become very hot issues in the world today. And secondly, I think the RMA, or the Revolution in Military Affairs, is advancing very fast in other developed countries, especially in the United States. And I think China is lagging far behind. Of course, this revolution not only refers to the revolution or development of hardwares, but also to softwares and soft ideas and concepts, etc. Thirdly, we are facing realistic challenges from other countries. The military activities directed against China, including those activities directed against China by the United States, like close range reconnaissances, like the arms sale to Taiwan, like large-scale military exercises on China's periphery, like some of the areas in which China is lagging far behind, such as outer space security, internet or cyber security, etc. So I think in this regard, China are facing very, very serious challenge and even threats from our side. I think in the security sector of China, we've got different or controversial views over different issues, and there are wide debates in China. That's my slide.
That's a superb response. Thank you. And there are many elements there that we want to pick up on. But Ding Li, let me come to you and let you supplement what General Zhu just said.
These days there is a trend of securitizing everything. 就泛安全化, you can call financial security, mental security, ecological security, and then therefore you have no security because everything is security. I would more focus state office of information office, 国务院新闻办, last year put forward a white paper, China's peaceful development, in which it listed 6 items of core national interest. I think it's too many. We only need 1 or 2 core, but given a country of this size, probably 6 is still understandable. 1, sovereignty. 2nd, national integrity. 3rd, unification. 4th, national security, which is the same. Mm-hmm. 5th is China's economic development. The 6th is China's institution per its own tradition and history, namely the party's leadership. China is in a very unique situation that as a major power, it's not unified. And part of it has a complicated relationship with a major part of it. So the relationship of the 2 parts are improving. And the superpower has been having a complicated relationship with both parts of it. As a major power does not have a sovereignty issue. I don't think UK has a sovereignty issue to allow Scotland to vote for independence, but not a sovereignty that the other part is not under current UK central government jurisdiction. So I think, in my view, these are more or less the first 4 items, traditional security real, because it's national security. And the other 2 are political security, regime security, and economic security. But within the term of economic security, you have to define everything that would hurt economic security constitutes threats to China. That can be premature renminbi appreciation, which would in turn to create difficulty in competence of export, job, social stability, and the regime's legitimacy, and the parties ruling. So all these are intertwined. Therefore, in my view, we have to make sure that we devote a necessary resource to make sure this would not explode, and also to improve the foundation that the root cause for this security problem would be addressed properly. So eventually, we would have a sufficient confidence that this source of insecurity would disappear, or at least would reduce.
Thank you, Ding Li. And Li Chun, you've worked quite a lot on non-traditional security yourself, but I'd be interested in your views about cultural security, or any thoughts that you have on this subject, general subject.
I agree with one point that Professor Shen just mentioned, that we have a tendency of securitizing everything, in terms of political, economic, and cultural issues. I never heard the cultural security issue. I never heard this concept, so I don't know what I'm going to say. But I also agree with General Zhu on the complication of China's environment. This is very much true. We are facing challenges, lots of challenges, both internally and externally. So since I don't know what the cultural security means, that I would like to say something. I would like to say something in general about the challenges that China is facing. I think really that we are facing a lot of difficulties at different levels, domestic level, regional level, international level. Domestically speaking, that we are facing a lot of challenges ahead. If you read the report, I mentioned once again the report of the 18th National Congress, it's elaborated everything, I think, a lot of issues concerning economic issues, political structure reform, and also social structure reforms, and so on and so forth. But I think that the fundamental issue for China is, especially in terms of the domestic economy, is that how to strike the balance between the role of the government and that of the market. This is a big challenge for China for next 10 years. That we need to do this kind of reform, and another kind of reform internally is about how to redistribution of wealth. This is something that the next 5 years that we have to deal with this issue, because we are now facing the widening gap between the rich and the poor, and also the widening gap between the regions. And also at the regional level, I think we are also facing a lot of challenges. And General Zhu mentioned something about the security concern of maritime disputes, and a lot of maritime disputes in East China Sea and South China Sea. This is a big challenge. And also how to improve our relations between Japan, because the Japanese and Chinese relations is very fragile nowadays, and we need to improve the relations with this. And also, I think in East Asian society, how to coordinate Chinese and Americans' ideas and strategies in East Asian region, which is very important for the regional stability, and especially the building of the regional architecture. And finally, I think at the international level, I think the fundamental challenge for China is to define a global role, which will be in China's interest as well as will be accepted by the international society. This is a big challenge for us. How much responsibility that China should take on in international society, and what kind of role that China is going to play in international society. I think that still we are not finished this. We have not solved this problem. And also, I think the biggest challenge for China is that China has not yet ready to take a lead in international society, not only in terms of the willingness, but also in terms of the capacity and capability and experiences. So we are facing different levels of challenges. They might not be a security front, but also it's concerning about the foreign policy. But I would like to say that domestic issues are still first priority for our leaders, not international one.
Mm-hmm. Great. I want to come back, if we have time, and I'm sure maybe in the subsequent sessions, to this question of China's not taking lead, participating, let's say, participating and assuming its global responsibilities. the FuzirendaDagwa, the responsible stakeholder issue. I want to come back to that, but let me, if you'll excuse the metaphor now, pivot to the question of the U.S. Rebalancing policy in East Asia, or in the Asia-Pacific, I should say. How can you three give us some sense of the debates inside of China in recent months, or since this rebalancing was announced by President Obama in the Australian Parliament and last year? What are some of the debates about the interpretations of the U.S. rebalancing to the region? Maybe we can start with General Ju. There must not be a single interpretation, but we Americans would like to have a better sense of the domestic debates and the nuances in this on this issue.
Well, actually, there are controversial views in China over rebalancing, over back to Asia, over the modification of Asian-Pacific strategy of the United States. Recently, I believe that one of the major arguments is that this sort of rebalancing is not intended to contain China. Because if you look at the realistic situation, that economic focus is moving from transatlantic to trans-Pacific. So Asia is becoming the locomotive of the world economy. Therefore, they believe that the United States will have to rebalance itself to make a rebalance between not only East Asia and Europe, but also between nations. This is one of the arguments. Second is the fact that many people hold this sort of view. They believe that this sort of rebalancing or pivot strategy or modification of U.S. Asian-Pacific strategy are mainly intended to contain China. This sort of school argues that it is because some of the Americans believe that China's development may force the United States to withdraw from East Asia. And some of the Chinese even believe that some of the Americans believe that China's development will force the United States to give up some of its leadership to China. Because China's development has been very fast. With the economic growth, Chinese military will have to develop correspondingly. And they would argue, they put forward this argument on the reality, on the practices of foreign and the military aspects of the United States. Because if you look at the strategic review, Obama administration has already published 8 review reports, none of which is dedicated to the modification of U.S. Asian-Pacific strategy. But many scholars in China would prefer to argue that according to the practice, diplomatic and military practices, the U.S. military or U.S. Asian-Pacific strategy has been modified to a very, very great extent. So they summarize the modification into 4 categories. One is to strengthen the alliances in this area. Second is to expand partners. Third is trying to to find a new military foothold. They argue that back to Asia is not true because the United States has never left Asia ever since the U.S.-Spanish War in the Philippines in 1893. And therefore, they believe that back to Asia is actually back to the original military bases that used in the U.S. used in the Cold War years, like King Run Bay, like Subic and the Clark. And furthermore, they might hope to find a new military foothold. So they've got new bases in Darwin of Australia, and they even believe that the United States will try to find a new base in Myanmar, which can be used to both contain China and the United States. Of course, the final purpose of this modification is to contain China. So that's another different view. Because of the differences of the views over rebalancing, pivot strategy, and the diplomatic and the military practices of United States in East Asia and the Asian Pacific region. So actually, I don't think the Chinese have got a very unified consensus, or they've got a unified conclusion over that. So the debate is still going on.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, the debate's still going on in this country, too,
Yes.
about what it means and whether we have the money for it. Ding Li, do you want to?
Well, I think it's a matter of defense-offense. My personal view is that the U.S. Did this in order to prevent bad things from happening, prevent American being hurt, and prevent American ally being hurt. But China would view this as U.S. forceful offensive behavior to restrain the freedom of action of China in an offensive way. But to us, a previous case, Barbara Zwarek proposed the wording as responsible stakeholder a few years ago. Initially, China was caught and did not understand what's the meaning. Stakeholder, we should have some stake. You give us a stake. We deserve some stake. You think we are different partner. Now you try to bring us to a high level, but then what do you want us to do to shoulder some responsibility which we may not need to do? But after internal deciphering this for a few months, China start to accept in a positive way. And China reciprocally proposed to President George W. Bush that we should not only be responsible stakeholder, but also constructive collaborator. 不仅仅是利益相关者，还要做就是建设性的合作者。So China start to accept this. So I think at this time China is also experience a similar curve, feeling bad of the U.S. Aggressiveness. But then thinking U.S. is globally shrinking, no money to contain us. Very likely U.S. would globally reduce rather than to divert its resource, military asset to the region, or to bring a very minimal amount of additional force. And we are growing faster, so don't worry. And with a more careful reflection, we may categorize China's concern and others' concern over China into three categories. One is China has a legitimate, unfulfilled security task to attend, which is being undermined by American and other ASEAN neighbors. The weapon sale to Taiwan, in our view, we are a victim. And Vietnam recognized until 1970 that the entire Spratly and Praso belonged to China. And they negated their bilateral commitment. And the U.S. has been saying nothing about this, but simply pointing to China. And the U.S. mistakenly, in our view, reverted Diaoyu Island to Japan. And we think it's a problem, but we try to shelve the difference. But then U.S. is raising a stake by emphasizing that the U.S.-Japan airlines apply to this issue. So we think all this aggressive. So why point to us? And for all this, we have been taking low profile, trying to peacefully settle each of them and all of them eventually. But at the same time, with the rise of capacity, we should not always accept that we should be the victim. So sometimes when the other would push the envelope too far, for instance, we cautioned our fishermen to be careful in the area of Huangyan Island. And our fishermen tend not to be interested in going to that place because the government seems not to protect them. And then that may embolden the Philippines government to take aggressive behavior, bringing our fishermen to the deck of their warship to expose them to the sun. That is unacceptable because the Philippine government has persistently drawn Huangyan Island to the Chinese side. They did this from 1947 when we first claimed in a holistic sense till 1997 for 50 years. So they start to change in the last 10 years and they are aggressive. So that would make us to counter, given our rising capacity, so we would stop them. So this is not our aggressivism. Of course, there are some disputes over EEZ and the application of national rights in the EEZ, whether China is entitled to enter Vietnam's EEZ, which overlaps what we claim as the South China Sea area, which belong to the parts of China's non-dash line, and the U.S. Potential rights to conduct a reconnaissance mission inside the China EEZ. These are all under disputes. So we have these all three things. The last is disputable. The first is what China feels it has been victimized, and we are still not able or do not want to use our force to change to our favor at this time. But for some cases, we want to change, and we think it's legitimate. But what we think, what we have been doing legitimately might be viewed as forceful and pushing the envelope too much. So I would say the U.S. pivoting come under all this background. U.S. has a legitimate concern, and that without a proper dialogue and explanation, that could in turn invite China's negative response. But when China would reflect over its own action and would be more confident in seeing the U.S. fundamental purpose of all this, China may take a less negative view toward this. So China would not welcome U.S. behavior. So I think both sides are adjusting. U.S. has watered down the name to rebalancing. Mm-hmm. And China, more and more Chinese view, like General Zhu and myself thinking this is U.S. preventive, defensive kind of action. It's a defensive. So take it easy. We should dialogue with U.S. to relieve the U.S. Legitimate concern. We should protect the U.S. freedom of action, at least beyond our EEZ, at least beyond. It's the U.S. legitimate rights, and every country should protect it. And we have that rights as well. We need the other country to protect our rights. But within our EEZ, we should dialogue, because the UNCLOS has never mentioned clearly whether China has a right to expel the U.S. mission, or the U.S. has a legal right to do such an intelligence collection mission. It's undeclared. So it's in gray area. Our two countries should be able to manage our difficulty. So over time, we have lots of common interest and common ground to work together. Should not devote our resources in contending in such areas that would in turn to create unnecessary tension in the region and the world.
I'm a little conscious of the time and the clock, and we have many good panels following on today, and we promise you a coffee break. And I want to try and squeeze in maybe two more questions before we end this panel. But Julie, first of all, do you have any thoughts on the rebalancing pivot issue?
Just following General Zhu and Professor Shen's, I think they are right that this is still ongoing debates over this issue. And it has facilitated a greater debate in China about China's strategy, especially China's policy toward the East Asia. And overall global strategy of China. This is the first point I would like to add to their idea. Secondly, I would like to say that it depends on what kind of approach you take when you look at this American strategic pivot to Asia. One approach is a zero-sum approach, is either-or approach. The other is a much more larger approach, or I should say regional approach, because this region is developing very fast and the Americans want to take advantage of this kind of development. And also they said that it's defensive one. The United States has an aspiration to control the situation in Asia, which is volatile, which is developing. Finally, I would like to say something that there is really someone criticizing this American rebalancing policy in terms of several things. One is that there is not enough space for China and not enough, especially concrete steps on this strategy on how to develop Sino-American relations, because a lot of emphasizing on American side, American allies and American Gazi allies, but not many concrete policies toward how to develop Sino-American relations. And this is the first thing that many Chinese criticize, and that kind of development, I think, caused a lot of criticism among Chinese scholars, and also make a Chinese perception of the United States in a downturn. This is also really true. Secondly, I think the American pivot to Asia emphasized too much on military means, too much military exercises and too much military deployment. This is also being criticized. Thirdly, I would like to say that TPP also very much discussed among Chinese scholars. Some gave positive comments, but some gave very negative comments on this TPP, because they believe that this strategy is very much divisive for East Asian cooperation process.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to steal 5 minutes from our coffee time, because actually I've noted we started this session about 5 minutes late, and see if I can squeeze in my last two questions for our panelists. First of the two is, let me pose it primarily to General Zhu and Professor Shun. Do you think there's an understanding in China about the security dilemma that is taking place between China and its neighbors on the one hand and China and the United States on the other as a result of China's military modernization? To what extent is there a consciousness of this notion of China's role in the security dilemma? Professor Shun and both of you have spoken already about American contributions to the security dilemma. Could you say a little bit about the Chinese part of this?
Me first?
You first.
Okay. I think at present the biggest security dilemma for China is whether China can develop in a peaceful way. Mm-hmm. That's the biggest security dilemma for Chinese at the present, because Chinese hope to develop itself in a peaceful way, but many people are pretty much concerned about whether it can develop peacefully, because the people prefer to look at the military behavior of the United States against China in the recent years. So this is the biggest dilemma. I think for the Chinese military, I believe that it is a foregone conclusion that China will develop its military correspondingly with the economic development. In recent years, I believe that Chinese have invested tremendously on the military. Many reasons have contributed to the fast growth of military expenditure in China. One is the fact that during the year from 1978 to 1995, when Mr. Li Denghui was given the visa by the United States, the military expenditure of China did not expand, did not increase at all. If you take into consideration of inflation, I think military expense during these years have had reduced, actually. And therefore, because Chinese military was asked by the top top leaders in China to injure itself or to subdue itself, and
Tolerate.
So it did not expand with the economic development, the social development. This is one reason. Secondly, because of China's economic development, China has been asked by the world community to shoulder more responsibilities. And China is increasing its efforts in this regard. For example, in the peace operations of the United Nations, in HANDR, and in the economic assistance to the outsides, etc. Of course, in this regard, the military plays very important role. I still remember very clearly in 2004 when an earthquake happened in Pakistan. China provided a lot of materials to this country, but Chinese cannot send these materials to the earthquake-struck area. And it was all transported to this area by the helicopters from U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps. So the military attaché of Pakistan said to me, it seems to the Pakistani people that the United States is providing such a big amount of assistance to the country, but they did not see China's efforts. So Pakistani military attaché, defense attaché in China encouraged me and asked me to speed up the defense modernization. Of course, that's one of the reasons. Of course, lastly, I have to argue that the military development or military modernization drive, especially the modernization drive of hardwares of China, has got something to do with the United States. I have always argued we have to appreciate two elements. One is the United States, because United States has taken so many actions against China in recent years in the military sense. And secondly, because the United States have put sanctions on China and have bans on China on the transfer of technologies. China was forced to develop its hardwares independently. If the United States did not practice this sort of ban on China, I think China would have been more dependent on the United States. So Chinese could have been produced a much greater check on China's development. This is the consensus among the security and defense planners in China, in Beijing. Second element is the fact that we have to appreciate Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian for the Chinese military, because without their independent secessionist efforts, I don't think we Chinese could have been able to develop the military so fast. And so that's true. That's the consensus among the security and defense planners. So I believe that in the future years, in 5 to 10 years or so, you will see a very, very big development in hardwares of the PLA. So because it was well planned, it's not the new plan. It was planned about 10 years ago. So some of the aircraft, some of the warships will be launched. And you will see some of guys might be surprised. So just take it easy. That's not for the purpose of fighting against the United States. We have neither intention nor capability to race against the United States. We have neither intention nor capability to drive the Americans out of East Asia. We believe that U.S. military presence in East Asia play a very positive role and a constructive role in this area. What we Chinese are very strongly against is the fact that this sort of presence is used to interfere into the internal affairs of China. That's what we Chinese are against. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dingley, do you have some thoughts on the security dilemma?
Well, all students of international relations understand that if anyone would build a strong capacity, that capacity would automatically generate a security dilemma. No matter how well intended, you are not going to intentionally use the capacity for wrong ends. But here, all stakeholders would justify their action through their own prism. China thinks that because U.S. weapons sell to Taiwan, because U.S. is liaising Vietnam when Vietnam has negated its word to invade 29 out of 129 islands and islets in Spratly. And when U.S. is back to Subic at a time when Philippines is negating its word that its westmost island is east of Huangyan Island. So China would think my capability is not big enough. China would, I think, knowingly ignore the security dilemma. That would automatically be created harmful to China. It's harmful because Vietnam can invite the U.S. back, could ally with U.S., could make the U.S. a constant part in the region, in addition to Philippines. So at the same time, I think more and more Chinese would understand the legitimate limit we need to impose upon ourselves. If 10 years ago we have invested because of Li Denghui and etc., now we have quite enough capability. We do not intend to compete with U.S. Let the U.S. to burn more money. Let's give our money to U.S. to help U.S. to drive its economy. But we need to collaborate in a way that China's build-up can be respected and be accepted within a certain limit. And the U.S. presence in the region would truly play constructive and defensive role, which would not encourage Philippines to intrude into the area where Philippines traditionally, for half a century, did not think to belong to Philippines. And Vietnam, until later 1970, still believed to belong to China. So U.S. need to encourage all stakeholders to stick to responsible action. If that can be attained, I think China-U.S. would automatically do not need to spend a lot. And the security dilemma would reduce to some extent.
Thank you, Dingley. I'm going to give Li Chun the last word by asking her, since she's studied and Chinese foreign policy debates and tried to explain Chinese foreign policy debates to outsiders, and with this excellent study she did in Paris that we spoke about earlier. What sort of advice would you have for those of us outside of China in interpreting and trying to understand Chinese national security and foreign policy advice? What would you caution us against? What mistakes do you think foreigners have made in interpreting these? What accuracy? Do you have any thoughts, just to close our session, on how we should understand your domestic debates?
Especially here in the United States, I think lots of people very much concerning about the China's threat toward the United States. I don't think this is right, because I fully agree with General Zhu and Professor Shen that I don't think that we are in security dilemma, especially between China and the United States. And I think China has tried very hard, or try its best, to avoid such kind of a security dilemma between China and the United States. This is a China's policy. If you read the white paper on China's peaceful rise or peaceful development issued last September, you will know that what China's policy is. Especially, I think the leaders in China tries very hard to establish kind of communications and exchange of views with the United States to avoid such kind of security dilemma. And I want to say that China has no intention and no capacity to compete with the United States, especially in another 10 or 20 years. And in another 20 years, by year 2033, Chinese old people aged over 60 will reach 400 million. We will be too old to fight. That's what I want to say.
Excellent. Right. Well, thank you for indulging us to go over time, but I think it was worthwhile and certainly worth time. We have several more sessions coming, and our Chinese panelists will be on the next panel. I want to just ask our organizers, do you want to take the coffee break, or should we go straight into the second panel? Want to stretch our legs for a minute?
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the first session.